Okay, hopefully I am live now. I've been having some technical problems this morning, and this is the first time I've ever done this, so do please let me know if you're there and you're hearing everything okay. So I'm Debbie Emmerson. I'm a clinical animal behaviourist. I'm a full member of the Association of Pet Behaviour Counsellors, and I'm registered with the Animal Behaviour and Training Council. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit this morning about rodents, which is great. So I predominantly work with dogs, but I'm absolutely passionate about rodents and particularly obsessed with rats, as anyone who knows me will account. So I'm normally always talking about them, and I can see people's eyes glaze over and they get a bit fed up with me talking about it. So hopefully this morning, oh, hi Kim. Hopefully this morning I'll be talking to some like-minded people who don't mind me rambling on and on about rodents, and hopefully won't be getting fed up with me and rolling their eyes, but if you do, I can't see, so it's okay. Oh, lovely. Thank you for saying hello, those are out there. It's nice to know that I'm actually talking to somebody. Okay, so some of you have sent in some questions, so thank you for that. It's really nice that people have been interested in this enough to send in some questions for me. So we're going to start answering them hopefully in order that they were posted. So I've got one from Katrin Smart, who says, what enrichment toys would you recommend for Syrian hamsters? Well, that's a great question, Katrin. I'm so glad you're talking about enrichment. I think this is so important for our caged pets. Dogs and cats get a certain amount of freedom that our caged animals just don't have quite the same access to. So their environment is entirely dependent on what we provide for them. So I'm a firm believer in that we should be doing everything we can to make sure they have a really, really enriching environment that they're happy in. Thank you, Vix, for saying that you can hear me. So enrichment, first of all, I want to start with kind of the basics. So enrichment is really important for our caged pets. We know that increasing the environmental complexity can improve their welfare, and that providing them with enrichment can make them essentially more optimistic, which is associated with better welfare. And we know that if we take enrichments away from animals, it can actually make them more pessimistic and give them sort of emotional states more akin to anxiety and depression. But it is important to consider what enrichments we're putting in for animals and that it's actually going to be useful for them. So to start off with the basics, we know that they have some fundamental needs that they need to be met, and it's really important that we actually make sure we're meeting those first, because environmental enrichment, the sort of added benefits afterwards, if we're not meeting their standard basic needs, isn't going to compensate for that. So I'm sure, Katrin, that you're already providing a lot of this, but I'm just going to go through the basics for anyone that maybe doesn't know quite so much about hamsters. So first of all, space is really important. Hamsters are solitary animals, but they still do need quite a lot of space. And we know that having them in smaller cages actually increases their stress. We also know that rodents really are sensitive to light, and they really like to hide. They're prey animals. In the wild, lots of things would eat them. So for them, hiding is a really, really important behaviour. So giving them shelters that they can hide in, preferably shelters that they can adapt so that they can add extra holes to, so things that are chewable like cardboard boxes is really important for them, so then they can decide where they want to have their entrances and exits. Research has shown that they have a preference for tunnels, tubes, particularly if they're enclosed at one end and about 15 centimetres long as opposed to shorter. And they prefer those over open-sided boxes, so probably because they offer a little bit more shelter and protection. And they do prefer shelters that are darker and actually kind of block out the light and make them feel sheltered, as opposed to those shelters that you can get that are a bit translucent so that we can see into them. Bedding's a really important aspect for hamsters, and actually we can provide quite a bit of enrichment just by looking at the bedding that we're giving them. So hamsters in the wild are burrowing animals. They like to have bedding that's at least 40 centimetres deep so that they can actually construct their own burrows. In the wild, they would have a burrow going into their sleeping chamber, and then from that they'd have a burrow coming out where they store their food, and another little chamber where they go to the toilet. So being able to construct their burrows is quite an important behaviour for them, and it's found that if they have deep enough bedding to do that, that can improve their welfare. But it's not always easy to provide bedding that's that deep, as well as providing them the height that they need to be able to stand up and stretch out. So as long as we're providing at least 3 to 5 centimetres of bedding that they can kind of bulldoze their way through and pile up, that can help. And we can ameliorate giving them shallower bedding by giving them nesting material so that they can at least create their own little bed chamber. So giving them the deeper bedding does help to relieve some of the stress behaviours that we might see, like bar chewing. But we can, if we give them the nesting material as well, that's really, really important. So it's been suggested that about 15 to 25 grams of nesting material per hamster, which allows them to construct a really nice bed. They would spend quite a lot of time in the wild, in the natural behaviours in captivity, building their nest, and maintaining it and keeping it nice and clean. We can also scatter feed them. So instead of giving them food in a bowl, if we sprinkle the food around their enclosure, because they're foragers, that behaviour is really, really ingrained in them. So they would spend a lot of time searching for food, manipulating food, putting it in the cheek pouches, taking it away to store it, and then putting it in their food storage chamber. So doing that can give them something quite enriching and natural behaviours to do. Wills are also quite important, highly valued by hamsters. So they would in the wild travel up to about 6 miles a night foraging, which is really quite a large amount. So having a will is something that they really do value. There has been some different suggestions about the functions of will running and whether it's entirely helpful or whether it's a slightly stereotypic behaviour. But what we do know is that hamsters want a will and they value having a will. So we should be making sure that there's a wheel available for them that's large enough that when they're running in it, they can be pretty much straight out with just a little tilt at the back, that they're not bending their backwards the back in a sort of unnatural and harmful manner. So it needs to be fairly large and ideally should be solid, so not the open wire rungs which they could hurt themselves on. So that's sort of the basic needs that we need to be meeting for the hamster, and then anything that we provide on top of that is an additional bonus. So things that provide climbing opportunities are quite valued by hamsters. There's not been a lot of research into exactly what toys they prefer. With a lot of the research that we have on rodents, it actually comes from laboratories, and the type of housing that they would have for rodents, even in their most enriched state, is often quite a long way behind what we would consider to be a really enriched environment that we'd be wanting to provide for our pet animals. So there's not a lot of research beyond what I've already talked about. But if we can make sure that they've got something that they can climb on, so ideally the shelters that they can chew and eat, some of them are edible shelters, some of them are just chewable, so they're sort of made of cardboard, that they can go in, they can hide, they can also climb on top, therefore it's sort of multifunctional. And they can chew different different holes into it to make it adaptable to what they want, like I mentioned earlier. What we do need to be a little bit cautious of with toys is anything with small holes. So you get these sort of wooden toys that have got little holes in them that the hamster can go through. Often these are a little bit too small for some of these animals, and have known and have experienced it myself with animals getting their heads stuck in it and having to rescue them from it. And I've heard of this happening with other people as well. So we want to be careful that anything we're giving them has got a large enough hole that if they do go in it, they're not going to get themselves stuck and end up getting into difficulty. We also need to be a little bit careful with large drops for hamsters. So they can climb, but they're not as agile as something like a rat. So they do tend to take a few tumbles. So we want to make sure that there's no really big drops from any toys or enrichments in their enclosure so that they're not going to hurt themselves. So often I think some of the best toys that we can provide are often the cheapest ones. There's a huge variety out there on the market that you can buy from. Often they are designed to appeal more to the human perhaps than to the hamster. So I've seen some ones that look like little children's playgrounds that look fantastic. There's a slide, there's a little climbing frame, but actually in reality the hamster's probably not able to use some of those things, and those features are a little bit more designed to appeal to our aesthetic senses than to the hamsters. So they wouldn't be able to actually use the little hooks to be able to climb up, and they perhaps wouldn't enjoy a slide where they're sliding down a smooth surface and not able to control what they're doing. So using things like cardboard boxes, cardboard tubes, getting a little bit inventive of tying these together to create bridges or mazes or little shelters for them and different things to climb on. And that means that because they're cardboard and they're disposable, they can be chewed by the hamster, and they can also be thrown away and replenished later on, so that you provide a little bit more novelty for the hamsters. Another thing we can do is provide puzzle feeders. And again, these don't have to be expensive. So because a large amount of their behaviour is taken up with foraging when they're awake, we can hide food around, so it doesn't have to just be scattered. We can use toilet tubes and fold the corners down and put a bit of food in there, or just scrunch up a bit of paper with some food in. We can tie those from the enclosures and hang them, so that the hamsters are having to stretch and reach and really try and find these foods, maybe tucking them under the bedding, so that they're having to work a little bit harder to find it, and all those sorts of things, just to provide a little bit more enrichment for them. So I hope that's answered your question, Catherine. I know I haven't talked too much about the actual toys that are available out there. So I think really any toys that you're providing on top of meeting all those basic needs really provides quite a lot of enrichment for the hamsters already. Okay, so the next question we have was from Jasper Brumfield, who says, I have 2 female mice. One of my girls is really friendly and extroverted and loves to be around me, but my other girl still runs in terror whenever I make sudden movements. She refuses to let me handle her and will make attempts to escape. I've had them both from the start for nearly a year with no incidents. Any advice? My black girl warmed up to me within days, but my other one really hasn't, and it's heartbreaking. And that's Marie Monteau has also said she's got the same problem, and I really sympathise with you. It's really difficult when we've got so much love to give our animals and they just don't seem to want it or be capable of accepting it. So I'll go through a few things that can help a little bit with this, and these are things that I know, Jasper, you've already got in place. So we know with rodents, the social rodents, that having a friend actually acts as a buffer and helps to reduce anxiety. So there has been this idea that I've heard people say before of getting a mouse or a rat by itself, so that you're its only companion and it has to therefore bond with you. And actually that's a little bit counterproductive, because what we find is that if they're on their own, they are more vulnerable, they feel less safe, and therefore they're actually probably going to be less likely to want to explore and less able to bond with you. So having these social animals in social groups is actually more effective at probably making them want to bond with us, and it enables them to adapt to change faster. Research has shown that when they're introduced to new environments, if there's more of them, they adapt much faster. So you've already got her with her sister, which is great. Also, providing environmental enrichment, which we've just talked about, can help to reduce anxiety in response to stressful events. So rodents that were exposed to a predator scent, if they were in an enriched enclosure, they actually cope better with the smell of the predator around than if they were in a barren environment. And I'm sure you probably already have a nicely enriched cage. So really it comes down to the fact that animals have different personalities. We all know this. We have pets, we've experienced their different personalities. You get the really shy ones, you get the really confident ones. You can have animals that have been reared in completely the same environment and just have maybe a genetic predisposition to different behavioural traits. Some animals never quite come round to you, and some do. And so to some extent, we do just need to change our expectation of what that relationship is going to be, and accept that maybe not every animal is going to be as confident and as handleable as we might have wanted it to be, and that she perhaps needs something a little bit different from you, perhaps a slightly less physical and tactile relationship. So I'm going to go a few things that might just help with it. So having a TV or radio on nearby can help to habituate the animals to noises, so that she's not so jumpy whenever you move or make sudden movements, which you say. So having that noise and perhaps the movement on TV might help her to get used to that. But we do need to be careful, because rodents have a really well-developed sense of hearing. So actually we don't want them to be too close to electrical equipment that might be emitting ultrasonic sounds that we can't hear, but that might be stressful to the animals. So having it on fairly quietly in the background, a little bit away from the cage, might be helpful. You can also try offering her really high value treats in her cage where she feels safe. So something that she has to hang around to eat, that she can't just snatch and grab and run off with. So I find something like yogurt really helpful for this. So if you rub your hands in some of the bedding in her enclosure so that your hands smell a little bit more familiar, and then try offering a bit of yogurt initially on a spoon so that your hand can be a little bit further away from her, and try offering that to her perhaps when she's in the comfort of her shelter in her nest in her enclosure, so that she can just start to come out in her own time and eat that, and start to associate your presence with her getting this nice tasty treat that she doesn't often get. We can then use that in a bit of training, which I'll mention in a minute. So another thing is that we know predictability and control is really important in animals. The more they can predict something happening, and the more control they have over that, the happier they feel about it. So the stress of routine procedures can actually be reduced in animals if they are able to predict it clearly and concisely. So if you have a nice, clear, consistent cue of when you're going to be handling her, that can help her to know when that's going to happen. So it might be that you want to use a word, or it might be that perhaps whenever you're going to handle her, you'll use a cardboard tube to get her to climb into, and so that cardboard tube itself can become the predictor of now you're going to be handled. And then providing a reward after that's happened can help to associate that with it actually not being such a scary thing. I mentioned the cardboard tube. That can be really useful for small animals if they're a bit scared of being held and picked up and it makes them a bit jumpy. We know that they like to shelter. So if you remove some of the enrichments from the enclosure and offer a cardboard tube, put your hand on one end, allow her to climb into it, and then pop your hand in the other when you do need to move her and handle her. That can be a nice way of getting her out of the cage without her getting too frightened to start with. And you can actually use a reward for her doing that. So you might want to offer a reward when she goes into the tube so that she starts to do that as a trained behaviour. If you do need to pick her up, I'm sure you probably already do this, but there are a variety of methods that have been used for mice, picking them up by the base of the tails. In laboratories, scruffing them used to be quite common, and actually we know that those can increase stress as well. So the best way to pick them up, if you are going to do it by hand, is to just place your hands around them and cup them, or use the tube as I mentioned. What you can try and do is, when you do get her and her sister out, is if you've got a sweatshirt or a hoodie, you can pop her inside, perhaps even within the cardboard tube, pop the cardboard tube with the mice into your jumper so that she starts to get used to your smell. She's in a nice kind of secure, darkened area, and she might hopefully start to associate your smell with that of being safe. And make sure you do take her sister with her, because if you're separating them, that can induce stress as well. I mentioned before that, sorry, I keep saying that. Rodents are really sensitive to light, and low light levels are preferable for them. They can get quite damaged eyes from high light levels. So what you might find is that when you're trying to get her out of her enclosure, is that taking her out from where she's quite sheltered and has got maybe levels and hides in there, that it's quite bright when you bring her out. And that might be one of the things that she's finding quite aversive. We also know that these small rodents, because they are prey animals, they are quite scared of big open spaces. So going from her nice, safe little cage out into the big wide world and big open spaces might be really scary for her. So you might find that offering the sleeve of a jumper for her to climb into, she's more willing to do that. Or perhaps having her come out within a shelter that you can then handle her from. We know that mice show strong fear responses to unfamiliar situations, particularly if they can't shelter, and they want to stay close to the edges of things and not be wide out in the open. So if you can try and allow her to come out of the cage rather than picking her up, it might be a very slow process, but at least she's doing it in her own time then, and you might find that she's a bit more willing to start exploring. What you might find particularly useful is if you put a blanket, so perhaps if you sit next to the cage with the door open, put a blanket over the cage and over your lap, so actually it's all nicely enclosed, so it's sheltered, it's dark, and you might find that she feels a little bit braver about coming out of the cage on her own, and you can pop some toys and treats around so that if she does venture out the cage, she's got something she can hide in, and some treats that she can eat. Will hopefully make her feel a little bit safer exploring, and then she might start to get a bit braver over time. So I hope that answers your question and helps you a little bit. I do feel your pain. I've had animals in the past that just don't really want to be handled, and it's a bit heartbreaking when you really want to handle them and give them lots of love. Okay, the next question from Jem Corey. What can you tell us about fear periods in rats? What a good question. This is a very complex process involving lots of neurological systems, not all of which are fully understood within the context of sensitive periods or fear periods yet. For the benefit of anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about, a sensitive or critical or fear period is a developmental phase during which animals are particularly sensitive to learning about what's safe or what's not safe in their environment. Sensitive periods tend to occur during adolescence because the animals are moving from a state of being dependent on their mum to a state of being sexually mature and an adult in their own right. So at this time, they're going to be starting to explore their wider environment. So they need to be curious, but they also need to be cautious because they're going to be coming into contact with lots of potential dangers, particularly when you're a rodent and you're the dinner of a lot of different animals. So rats have a really fast reproductive system. That's why rodents are so successful. They breed really quickly. So rats, as I'm sure you already know, Jem, they gestate for 3 weeks and they breed immediately after giving birth. So that means potentially they could have a litter of 3-week-old babies and then be having their next litter. So weaning happens at around 3 weeks. It can begin slightly earlier and they can be potentially fully weaned by 21 days, so 3 weeks. They reach sexual maturity at about 4 to 7 weeks, so they're actually ready and able to have their own babies by that stage. And they reach probably into adulthood about 60 days, so 8.5 weeks. So during this adolescent phase, they are really primed to learn, and that makes them quite sensitive to fear-related problems and things like anxiety. Now, the GABA system is a neurological system that's quite important in this role, and I'm not going to go too into the science of it, but essentially it makes them quite resistant to fear extinction during this phase. So if they've learned to associate something with fear, it's quite hard for them to forget that association during this stage. We know that younger rats, so infants, have a really low responsiveness to stress and are really not very good about learning about fear prior to the age of 10 days old. So sort of 0 to 10 days is a time when everything's great in their world and nothing's very scary, and actually they show an attraction rather than an avoidance of odours that have been associated with a shock, which is quite bizarre and seems counterintuitive to their survival. So that's what's happening early in their life, and then they're going to start to learn about things being a bit more scary as they get older. They also experience, when they're infants, something called infantile amnesia, where they actually seem to forget about things that have happened. So they can make an association to something that was fearful, and then if they have repeated exposure to that thing without anything bad happening, they don't just learn that it's safe, they actually seem to have forgotten that it was anything fearful in the first place. So they're sort of buffered in this infant stage against fear before they enter this fear period. So there's different types of fear. There's innate fear, which is fears that they don't have to learn, fears that they're born with. So for example, they will freeze in response to the smell of a predator, and that behaviour emerges at about 10 days old. And then by about 17 days old, they're showing an increase in startle response when they're in aversive states. So if they're in a fearful state, if they're already feeling a bit fearful, they're going to be more jumpy, essentially. So this perhaps marks the start of their fear period because they're having an increased responsiveness to potentially dangerous situations about 17 days old. With learned fear, this is where they associate something with maybe something painful happening or something really scary. And this means that animals are more likely to startle in the presence of something that they associate with fear than in the absence of it. So, for example, if you've handled them and they've had a really bad experience, maybe you handled them and accidentally got them, they're more likely to be fearful in your presence than your absence because of that negative experience. So the sensory systems develop at different rates, and therefore what they can learn to associate with fear can develop at different times during their development. So we know that they can start to associate a smell with fear at about 12 days old, and they can start to associate a sound with fear at about 16 days old. So prior to about 3 weeks old, they can associate unpleasant experiences with a cue, but not a context. So, for example, they could associate it with a sound or a word, but not with that particular environment. From 3 weeks on, the hippocampus in the brain has developed sufficiently. They can actually learn that certain contexts, certain situations are scary. So they might, for example, learn that outside of the cage is scary. Fear retention also develops with age. So at 18 days old, rats will associate a shock with that environment, and they'll retain that information for about a day. But when they're tested 6 weeks later, they've got very little retention of that fear memory. Whereas rats, when they're tested at 14 weeks old, they have that memory for 6 weeks later. So at 14 weeks, when they're adult, they will remember that fear association sort of indefinitely. So despite the fact that we see sensitive periods sort of developing at about 3 weeks old, we know that if rats are exposed to severe stress early on, that can actually cause lasting impacts and cause an early onset of fear development, really. So the severe stress in this particular example was that they were separated from the mum for 3 hours each day, which is quite a long period for a young rat. They're relying on mum for thermoregulation and things, so they were put in an incubator but away from mum. So that had lasting effects, and it wasn't forgotten in the same way that if they hadn't experienced that maternal separation, they would have forgotten it. But it's not all doom and gloom. So although this is a fear period, it also offers an opportunity for us to build trust with animals. So although they can learn about fear in this stage, they can also learn about what's safe. And research has shown that if we gently handle and stroke rats for 10 minutes twice a day between the ages of 3 to 5 weeks, that actually results in a reduced fear and an increased tameness towards humans. So if they're having positive experiences in this period of time, that's also going to be beneficial to them. It's not just that they're learning what's scary. And we have to bear in mind that a lot of the research that's been done about fear periods in rats has looked at electric shocks and associating things with electric shocks. So hopefully most of our pet rats are not going to be experiencing anything quite so aversive as that, and hopefully not going to be learning about fear and exposed to fear quite as much. But also we have to bear in mind that we can't completely avoid stress in our animals, and nor is that particularly an objective that we should be aiming for. Stress is inevitable in life, and actually being able to develop resilience to that stress is quite important. Some research showed that adolescent rats who were exposed to cat odour were more resilient to stress later on in life. Although in that particular experiment there may be quite a big factor with the social buffering, so these rats were kept in social groups, which just highlights to us the importance of keeping social animals in social groups. So rats that were kept in isolation after weaning had an increase in neophobia, which is where they're scared of anything new. They were more socially withdrawn and they were more aggressive. So it's quite important to be keeping them in social groups after weaning, and using that opportunity of the adolescent period from about 3 to about 8 weeks to make sure that they're having good experiences and learning about what lots of safe things are in their environment. So I hope, Jem, that gives you the answers you were looking for. Okay, comment from Annie Dale Caffrey. My actual hero, a rat behaviour specialist. Oh, thank you very much, Annie. That's really kind. I don't particularly consider myself an expert or a specialist. I really dislike those terms because I think it implies that you know everything, and I absolutely don't know everything. I think there's always so much to learn, and I'm always feeling like I don't know enough. But I consider anyone who loves rodents to be a hero of mine as well. So that goes both ways. I think anyone who doesn't love rats is really missing out and probably just hasn't met one yet, because I defy anyone to meet a nice friendly rat and not be absolutely smitten and converted. Okay, Grace. Grace Ralph. Rats. Advice on introducing a spayed female to 3 males. Carrier method tried and failed numerous times. The female becomes extremely aggressive towards the males and has already resulted in significant injuries. Okay. So yeah, having just spoken about how important it is for social animals to have social groups, things don't always work out quite how they should, really. You don't mention about this female's past and whether she's lived with rats before. As I said, they should be kept together post-weaning, and if you've rescued a rat that has been kept on her own for quite some time, then it might be that she's really not used to rats and hasn't learned how to interact with them and is quite scared of them. So research has shown that the ideal social groups, we'll all be pleased to know if we keep rats, is 12 rats in a group. 12 were shown to be less fearful than rats that were housed singly or in groups of 4. But rats that were housed in groups of 3 or 5 actually had better growth rates. So there's been a suggestion that a group of about 6 is ideal, providing there's enough space for them. But if we're providing environmental enrichment and socialisation, then that can actually offset some of the disadvantages of having them in smaller groups. But back to your female, because obviously she's not in a group at all at the moment, and that's the aim, is to get her living in a nice social group so that she has got that social support and social buffering. So we know if we expose singly housed rats to neighbours, rats in other cages nearby, that can help to reduce aggression when they're housed together. So what I would suggest is having your female in a cage next to your males so that they can start to smell and see each other. I would suggest with rats, knowing what they're like, to have the cages just a couple of centimetres apart, so that they can't bite each other through the bars or put their little lovely rat hands through and grab at each other, because rats are quite good at that. So just allowing them to smell each other through the cage. The carrier method, for any of you that are not familiar with what this is, this basically involves when you're doing introductions with animals, rats or gerbils or mice, popping them all in a carrier together, sometimes walking around with them, so that it's a little bit stressful. The idea being that the stress kind of bonds the group together, that they have a common enemy. It sort of works on the idea that when rodents are scared, they kind of go into a bit of shutdown. They freeze in response to predators. So that means that they're not fighting. But what you might find is that whilst they seem to go together all right, once you then put them into a cage and the stress of being carried around in a carrier or being in a new environment, once that is over, the fighting may start to begin, which is perhaps what you found, Grace, with your female. So what I would suggest then, if you found that the carrier method hasn't worked and is perhaps just making potentially a fearful female even more fearful, try with the cages next to each other initially, and swap them over. So put the female into the male's cage and vice versa, so that they're each going into different cages, maybe every couple of days, so that you're starting to swap their smells, they're getting used to each other's smells and starting to form a bit of a colony smell. So their scents would intermingle and produce a group smell. Because rats really identify each other from the smell, and if we can make them have that familiar group smell, then they're more likely to accept each other. If you're doing that and then you stop seeing any signs of aggression, so if they're not aggressing at the bars and they don't seem to be getting aggressive when they go into the different cages and smell the other rats, what you can then do is start to introduce in a neutral territory. So I would have a new cage set up, ideally a fairly simple medium-sized cage with not too many levels, or ideally probably no levels or just one, so that the rats can't get away from each other too much. We tend to find that if there's too much space, there can be quite a bit of chasing, and if one rat's trying to climb and get away, the other one can bite the tail or the bottom and cause injury. So you want a fairly simple medium-sized cage. Needs to be neutral, and I would pop some enrichments in there. Don't kind of overload it with enrichments so that they can hide too much, and you want to avoid any enrichments where they're going to get trapped inside. So everything should be quite nice and open. So open hammocks, big open tubes where they can run through and go out the other end. And I would start with the male who you think is going to be the most indifferent to her. So not the most kind of dominant, who's going to kind of try and put her in her place, because that might just scare her and make her react to him, and also not the male who's most friendly and you think is going to be really likely to run up to her and try and make friends, because again that might cause her to freak out. So ideally you want to be starting with a male who's pretty indifferent. So pop him and your female into the neutral cage together, and as much as possible try and just leave them to it. It's really tempting to hover, and I've done introductions. I know how stressful it is. You're desperately trying to make sure that they all just get on and that they're not causing each other any damage, but that stress can kind of rub off on them, so try not to hover if you can help it. If that all goes according to plan and they settle, then you can add the next male in, and so on until they're all introduced. So that could potentially take days or weeks. It's a slower process and more gradual process, but if you've found that the carrier method hasn't worked, then hopefully this might be a little bit more successful. By doing it this way, you're hoping to avoid overwhelm of the female if she's finding this too scary and too stressful, and it's just making her become aggressive. So hopefully she'll find this method a little bit gentler and more able to cope with it. I have in the past, when I've had difficult intros, particularly with large groups introducing one additional animal, used a scented spray on them. So I used vanilla spray, so just a bit of vanilla with some water, sprayed that all onto the rats to give them a communal scent, and it also gave them something to be grooming and focusing on. The thing to be aware with that is that once all of that vanilla or peppermint or whatever you use, once that smell has been groomed off, you might find that fighting starts to emerge then. So just be a little bit wary of that. So I hope that helps. Try that method. If you really are still struggling, give me a shout and we'll see if there's anything else we can look at. Okay, next question is from Rachel Hurley. Similar theme really. So help, I have 2 male guinea pigs nearly 18 months old. I've had to separate them as they're fighting constantly, and they're now living in separate cages next to each other. So you're already doing the separate cages next to each other, which is ideal. What's the best way to remedy this problem? Should I neuter and bond with females? Will they ever be able to live together? So there's a lot of mixed information out there about guinea pig boars, about whether they can live together or not. There's lots of people that say that you can't keep boars together, and there's lots of people that say that's rubbish, I've got boars living together quite happily. So they can be a bit tricky to house together, particularly if they're not related, or space is limited, or if there are any females around. So the smaller females near them can make them fight. Sometimes they fight if they're in slightly larger groups, so it can be better if you are keeping males to just have 2 together, but you have that situation, and as you found, that doesn't always work either. So space wise, if you've got 2 together, you ideally need to have about 11 square foot of space to give them all enough space to move around. If they're in cramped conditions, we know that can increase aggression with animals. So that might be something that you just want to look at and see whether the cage is big enough for the 2 of them, because that might be an issue that you can rectify quite easily. Do need to point out, not all individuals are compatible. Animals are like us, they all have their own personalities, and despite being social, we would find it very difficult to live with a lot of people, which is why we choose our life partners very carefully. And the same goes for animals. Not every pairing is an appropriate pairing. They just might not like each other that much, particularly if they have very similar personalities. and it's hard for them to establish a nice stable hierarchy because neither one of them wants to back down. That can be quite difficult as well. So what I would suggest is that you try the same method as above. You don't say whether you've tried to reintroduce them yet or not, or whether they've just fought the once and came apart, and you don't say how serious that the fight was, whether they've actually drawn blood on each other, or whether it was just a bit of sort of dominant struggles and nipping and rumble strutting and so forth. So I would suggest, before going down the neutering and getting more guinea pigs path, just try the method that I mentioned earlier of having them in the separate cages, doing swapping over so that they're mixing the scent, and then try and reintroduce them on neutral territory. Make sure that they've got plenty of space, and that they've got plenty of resources, so multiple places that they can eat hay, multiple water bottles, so that they're not having to have any competition over resources. If that doesn't work, it's probably worth neutering them at that point and seeing whether you can then reintroduce them once they're neutered, because having them neutered, if you're going to do it to introduce girls anyway, you might as well neuter them and just see if you can get them back together at that point. If that still doesn't work and they're still fighting even once they've been neutered, then your opportunity to go and get some more guinea pigs, and you can get a couple of girls to pair up with each of them. Some rescues offer a bonding service, which is really, really helpful. So if you go in there and say, I've got these two boars that each need to go and live with a female, they can actually hopefully try and find a female that each of the boars gets on well with and pair them up for you so that you can take two bonded pairs home with you. The benefit of that is that the males actually get to choose their companions, so they might be able to try them with a variety of females that they've got at the rescue. So it's, again, not a case of you saying, okay, here's your female, you've got to live together happily now, but they can actually choose who they get on best with. It might mean that you don't get the guinea pig of your choosing, it might not be as handleable and friendly as you perhaps wanted, or might not be the colours that you would have chosen. But if it means that you have two happy boy guinea pigs living in nice stable social groups, then that might be worth doing. So I hope that helps you. It's not a guarantee that your boys are going to live together, but it's also not a guarantee that you won't. It gives you a couple of options to try before you go down the route of getting more guinea pigs and having to have two big enclosures set up for them. Okay, Kim Rathborn has a question. I've got two neutered male guinea pigs that are brothers. So these ones that are actually living together quite happily. They're 3 years old. When I clip Neville's nails, he always bites. I've never had a guinea pig do this before, and I'm confident that I'm handling him carefully and supporting him. But for some reason, he still bites me or the person that's handling him. Yeah, so guinea pigs have quite fast growing nails, which means they need to be trimmed quite frequently, and that's not something that they normally enjoy very much, but unfortunately is something that needs to happen because they also tend to curl around quite a lot and get really uncomfortable. So guinea pigs are quite panicky animals generally and do find restraint quite unpleasant. So they will quite often respond with squeaking, fidgeting and nipping, and it's basically his just way of saying that I don't like this, please stop. You don't say how hard he's biting. I would suspect he is probably just giving a little nip rather than a full-on blood-drawn bite, because that is quite a common way of guinea pigs communicating if they're being restrained and they don't like it. You've not had this problem before with any of your other guinea pigs, which suggests that you are handling them well. So it might just be down to his own personality. Maybe Neville's just finds this particularly unpleasant, is just not very resilient to having his nails clipped, or maybe he's just a particularly assertive guinea pig who's going to tell you that he doesn't like it in no uncertain terms. So although I have no doubt you're supporting them properly, for the benefit of anyone else who's listening who doesn't know how to do this, I'll just quickly run through how to restrain them properly. So ideally you want to have them on a non-slip surface, so that can involve putting a towel down on the table. You want to pop the guinea pig on that. Ideally you want to do this with two people if you can. It just makes life a little bit easier. So sort of have the guinea pig with their bottom resting into your body, and then you can use one hand under their chest just to lift them up to about 45 degrees. It's quite important that we don't lift their back legs off the surface and that we don't tip them right backwards, because all rodents find that quite unsettling. They prefer to be able to rest their bottom and their back feet on something and to be at about 45 degrees rather than tipped right back. Then use one hand to restrain the paw while you're actually clipping the nails. They tend to be quite soft nails, so clipping's normally pretty easy and painless. You do just need to be aware that when clipping, they have a quick in their nail. If they've got white nails, it's really easy to see that. It's a little pink bit, and you want to avoid cutting the pink bit. If they have black nails, it's much harder to see, so you're better off leaving the nails a little bit longer rather than cutting through that, because that is painful. It will bleed, and that will make guinea pigs quite wary of having their nails trimmed. So as he seems to find this quite unpleasant, what I would suggest is that you do some training with him in the same way that we would with a dog. So use a tasty treat while he's being restrained. So maybe something that he doesn't get too much, a little bit of carrot, or something like that. And while you're restraining him, just let him eat that tasty treat. Do that a couple of times so that he starts to get used to, actually, when I'm being restrained, nothing bad happens, I just get to eat some nice food. Once he's tolerating that without getting upset, do the same and just try and clip one claw. I know it's frustrating when you've got them out and you're ready and you've got the clippers, you want to clip everything and go for it, but that just might be a bit too overwhelming for him at this stage. So try just cutting one claw a day, each day, so he's getting used to it and he's getting to eat something tasty while he's having it done. Then if he's tolerating that all right, start trying to do 2 claws and then rewarding him, and so on, adding an extra claw each time, so that you're eventually, hopefully, getting to the point where you can do them all in one go. Or it might be that he can only ever kind of tolerate one paw at a time, so you might be able to do all of the claws on that paw and then have to give him a little rest for a few minutes, let him eat something tasty, and then try again with the next foot. So hopefully that will make the process a bit more rewarding for him and change his emotional response that he's having to nail clipping, so you can get accustomed to it at his own pace, and a pace that he can cope with, rather than insisting that we do it all in one go. So hopefully that helps you. I don't appear to have any more questions that have been submitted previously, so I'm just going to have a look on the current page and see if anyone's added any more questions while I'm talking. So bear with me a second. Some issues with touching things. Okay, so I've had a question about parrots. I'm not going to answer any questions about parrots. I'm not a parrot expert. If you want any answers on that, I would suggest Elaine Henley would be your person. I won't pretend to be an authority on parrots. I've got questions. Do I need to change the Syrian hamster's cage setup in order to give more enrichment? I don't know if I've missed a question from you, but without knowing more about your Syrian hamster setup already, I couldn't possibly say whether you need to change it. So if you missed the beginning of the live chat, if you want to go back and watch the recording and see what I've said about hamsters, hopefully that will answer any questions you've got. Do I know why some guinea pigs are more vocal than others? We have one boy who weeps loudly and often. He also chats generally. He's confident and friendly. Could it be just to get our attention? Yeah, quite possibly, Kat. As I said before, they all have their own different personalities. Some are chatty and some are not so chatty. Some wiggle their ears when they're weeking, which is really cute. Others don't. Some scream at you, some week more quietly. So yes, I think it's probably just personality differences. If he's friendly and confident, then yeah, he's maybe just not feeling inhibited at all and is using his vocal range to the full extent. So enjoy. I love the guinea pig noises. I think it's one of the best things about them. So it's nice to have a chatty one. That's so wonderful. Yes, they are, Danielle. I couldn't agree more. Okay, I don't think there's any other questions on there unless I've missed any. So if anyone wants to add anything right now, please do. Otherwise, I will leave it there and say goodbye. So I'll just give you a minute or so just to see if you want to add anything or if I've missed anything. Kim Rathbone says thank you. So hopefully that answered your question as you would want it. Yes. Okay. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else there. So I'm going to say thank you so much for listening to me ramble on about rodents for nearly an hour. It's a pleasure of mine to be able to talk about them with an audience that's happy to listen. So I hope it's been helpful for everyone that's asked any questions, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Take care. Bye bye.